Well, it is 1:05, so maybe we should get started and we'll probably have a few more folks join as you go along, but I can pull up the presentation. Okay, can everyone see that?
Yes.
Okay. So I'll just let you guys take it away. I don't know who wants to go first, so just jump right in.
I'll kick it off, Tom, and I'll turn it over to you, and we'll go away. Let's just do quick introductions. A lot of very familiar names, so I think introductions can be pretty brief. But I'm Jim Schowalter, former commissioner, state budget director, and many other roles in the budget side of state government. I'm really pleased to be with you today. Obviously, it's been a couple of years since I was in that role. I'm really happy that Commissioner Campbell is continuing on, and there's a lot of things going on the last couple of sessions. Currently, I'm working as a consultant, most notably with the Minnesota Wild and helping the city of St. Paul and some projects and plans there, as well as doing a little teaching over at the Humphrey School. Soon I will be working with people trying to teach them financial management over there. So that should be a great adventure. Tom.
And I'm Tom Hanson. I am chair of the legislative practice at Winthrop and Weinstein. I served as the M&B commissioner under Governor Pawlenty from 2007 through 2010 when Jim was the budget director for most of that period and then succeeded me. So we have a long history of working together and it's been a while since we've given a presentation like this. So for nostalgia's sake, it'll be kind of fun. With that, Jim, I'll kick it back to you to get us started.
All right. To Tom's point, yes, we have not run this dog and pony show for many years. So we'll see how it goes. But mostly, I want to set the ground rules of conversation. And we're willing to tell you what we know and speculate to the extent we have useful insight and back at you, because we know that each of you have your own sources of information and insight as to what's going on. So let's just go to the next slide. The opening is just, I got to say that, oops, are you able to flip it, Margaret? There we go. We got a quick couple of steps that we're going to go through, a quick introduction. Minnesota in a national context, some of the things we're watching, and then just sort of some kind of a few takeaways of things that we're watching and looking out for. And really, that's almost like an entire launching pad for a conversation amongst this group. So let's skip to the next slide. Obviously, last session was a challenging one, and it looks like we might actually have a... Oh, that's interesting. This was not the deck I was expecting to pop up, but whatever. This will be good anyway. The last session, I just want to start by recognizing the tragedy of how it ended. There was plenty of political posturing and questions about how it was going to go with split majorities, the tough work that was ahead, and to end just days after special session with the shootings and the assassinations. It rips my heart out. I'm sure it rips everyone on this call. And I just need to start with that because, this is a deeply human process of working together to understanding big questions. And we have many thoughts and prayers. And I just recognize that I think everyone who's in public service, in elected positions and appointed positions and in state government is coming away from this time with different understandings and positions, and certainly a lot of thinking about where we're going forward. I'm going to pause there. Tom, anybody else want to say anything before we get to a more mundane state business?
No, I just wanted to just set the day. Yeah, I might echo Jim's comments that the exclamation point on the session was the tragedies in June, and that'll cloud everybody going forward. But as we talk about the budget and how it came about, Remember that the House was tied 67-67, but then we had the Roseville representative who stepped down. So it was 67-66. So the Republicans acted like they were in the majority, only to have that overthrown. So all that committee stuff got removed from the House website. You got to go to the Historical Society and actually find, or the Historical Society site or the Legislative Library site. So there's that piece. Also, the Senate was tied in January as well. So everything was late. You know, a lot of the things that normally happen in January either didn't happen or they happened in February. So everything got kicked back quite a ways, well into February and then into March. And then the only other dynamic that I found interesting that in all the years I've worked at the House and in the administration and now lobbying, I've never seen a tied institution, but in many respects, the House committees and the budgeting and the targets were essentially conference committees. And so the House produced a fairly status quo type budget, and then they went to conference committee and you dealt with the Senate. And in many instances, you had the Senate chair perhaps agreeing more with the House Republican than the House Democrat. So it all made for the weirdest session I've ever had. But that's just some overall context, Jim.
Yeah, and I would agree. And also just to sort of step back as we kind of think about the roller coaster and the almost annual historic nature of legislative sessions, that you know, the extraordinary session seems to be more the norm, where we were coming into this past legislative session recognizing the shared power and the split majorities that were likely to be dominating. Remember, it's just 2 years ago that we were talking about a record-setting surplus and record-setting budget that was about to be allocated. Remember, 2 years before that, we were talking about being in the midst of COVID and questioning whether we were going to get through the entire year based upon what we had in reserves because of fears about economic damage due to the pandemic. So you can keep on going back and you realize that, you know, the legislature and the public body politic has been through a roller coaster on a very regular basis. And that's been a challenge. And it's, I would also just remind you, and sort of one of my meta messages is Minnesota keeps on coming out of it. And despite that challenge, you know, if you look at other places, if they were dealing with some of the same challenges, it would be messier, I think, than you might see here. With that, let's go to the next slide. I'll take a first shot at these, and Tom, and then pass it over to you. The budget in brief, these are just the top line numbers. Thanks to our friends at Minnesota Management and Budget. They just are putting together kind of the summary view of what happened this last legislative session. You see on the left-hand side, the February forecast, the 26, 27 numbers, as well as the 28 and 29. Sort of the four-year forecast horizon still in the operative way we talk about the state budget. You can tell that the remaining balance in the forecast is evaporated. That you start the biennium with a little bit of money, but by the time you get out of the 4-year time, you know, you've already spent that through. That's due to that structural imbalance line that you see underneath it. It's been a while since you've talked about structural imbalance. It means, again, how much are you taking in, how much are you taking out in any given year or in any given 2-year period? And does it line up or do you spend more? In this case, both biennia, you're seeing more money being spent than coming in. A huge part of that calculation is because of that star not right underneath it, that these numbers include estimates of discretionary inflation. For those of you who go far enough back, you'll remember the time when it was in the forecast or when it got taken out of the forecast and now it's back in the forecast. It has a huge impact of how these 4-year numbers trend out. Because one of the things that you can do is, of course, allocate that discretionary inflation in the budget process, and then you get to something like the right-hand side of this chart where you see the end of session numbers. We'll talk a little bit more about it in a minute, but you'll see that much of what changed was the allocation or non-allocation of discretionary inflation, and how that sort of ripples through the entire budget. By the end of session, negotiations left us with a remaining balance of $1.9 billion, and it goes negative by 28-29. So that's a substantial improvement from where it started. And you can see that the structural imbalance also was carved down as you go through those periods.
When Jim and I were talking about this, we both have always had the same conclusion that we budget well in this state, that everybody talks, and focuses on the rancor between Republicans and Democrats. But whenever people ask me, whether I'm at the legislature or if they remember I was a M&B commissioner in the distant past, I tell them that Republicans and Democrats in the state should be proud of how they budget over a 4-year period, and they take it seriously. And I thought they did just from a finance perspective, the progress they made was impressive, in the things they did, given some of the political differences. The other piece, I think Jim and I have been, we've really worked together for about, 15, 20 years, and we've never agreed on how to portray inflation in the forecast. I think that it was more confusing this time because in the current biennium, you just kind of, hey, there's all this free money that's unallocated, and it went into the discretionary inflation account, and then you could pull that money. The Finance Committee in the Senate and the Ways and Means Committee in the House, when they set their targets, just distributed the money. I don't know if it had any relation to the inflationary aspect of the different budget areas. So I think it was more confusing. I don't think I was the only one. And I just one more plug, Jim, for it was in the forecast before, when we did it, and through all those years, it just stated it without baking it into the numbers and making it confusing. So those are my points on this. But I think the legislature has set itself up to do some really good work in the next year and the 2 years following.
Totally agree. Let's look at the next slide, because what you're going to see is the changes enacted by budget area. And you'll notice that there's significant changes in a couple of different areas, most notably in those first three, and much smaller changes, some positive even in some of the other areas. And again, that kind of gets you back to how are you allocating inflation? What is the share of the budget? What are the things that are growing automatically? You all have already lived through many of those discussions, so I'm not going to drag you through it unless you want to go back there. But the formulas in K-12 education or the forecasts in DHS, there's all kinds of deep level kinds of conversations that, thank goodness, legislators and staff are going through to try and figure them out. It gets confusing. I will totally agree with Tom at the top level for the public messaging as to whether inflation is in there or not. Because it obviously makes a big difference as to the bottom line and the top level messaging that people will hear and see in the newspaper if they don't get into the details. And the details are where they're important. You'll see significant reductions in the HHS area, taxes, as well as some in education. Note that K-12 education did have, I think, some discretionary inflation factor in it. So you're already sort of seeing the effect of having a formula increase and then sort of backing some of that off. So it was a pretty even-handed and challenging set of targets that everyone worked through. And you see some of the allocations that you have here. Tom, as you saw these numbers, did you think that this tilted one way or another, or how did you look at the allocation of balancing the budget?
Oh, I thought it was fairly, the overall numbers were fairly agreed upon, but in each area it seemed there were political sticking points. Like the big sticking point in E12 was the summer unemployment insurance that dragged out, and it was the issue where when the trifecta was in control, they pay for unemployment insurance and make unemployment insurance available to bus drivers and summer workers and school districts. And Republicans vehemently opposed it, tried various ways to push it through. And it was, I think, the big disagreement in the K-12 area. And taxes is a whole different animal. I thought the Senate Democrats and the House Republicans weren't that far off in what they did. It is what they came up with. And the House Democrats were a little farther away. And they had to work through that, but I don't think it was that significant of a tax bill. It did some things around the edges. It did the R&D tax credit, but then the business community generally gave up on data centers, sales tax exemption for data centers, and that was a big controversial issue. But that's why you see 212 and then some other cuts around the edges. But as I wanted to take a step back from this, Jim talked about how you put this together. And whenever I talk to people about the budget, I always say that whenever I did it, whenever we budgeted, I always started with the perspective that there were 6 things I had to know. And how many times have you heard me say this, Jim? But on the income side, it's the income tax, the sales tax, and the corporate tax. And that's roughly, 70 to 80, probably around 80%. So you had to know, you had to look ahead. If you're trying to simplify all this, you have to know what the trends are in the big money collection areas. And we're going to get to that in some of the charts where we look at the economy, because that's what drives revenue collections. And then I say it's the safety net, human services, education, and I lump all education, whether it's E12 in higher ed, and you get that, and that's about 70 to 72%. And then you throw in taxes, aids, and credits. Those are your 6 things that you have to know. And the rest of it, whenever I did this, when Jim and I did this together, you have to figure that stuff out. And then, unfortunately, some of this other stuff like state government and public safety were rounding errors. So
it is not an accident that many of the people who are in chief fiscal analyst or state budget director jobs or other things either came up through the Health and Human Services channel or the K-12 E12 channel. Because as Tom said, I only say 2 things because it's like I need to know on the spending side at least, that's where all the variations happen. And and right now we're seeing significant challenges in these areas, and that is really driving a lot of the budget discussion and budget context. I just want to add one thing while I see on this slide, state government and veterans, even though it's not in this target, one of the things that has happened since shortly after the budget was put into place was that MMB went into negotiations on labor contracts. And that was, potentially a big deal. And they did come out with a deal. I am not actually familiar with many of the specifics, but certainly setting it up were a lot of changes in the healthcare or growth in the healthcare costs for state employees, and a much more limited budgets on the operating side. While 2023 set pretty generous funding for state operations, as revenue growth and budget challenges came along, I think that's going to be under constant pressure, both in this session and future sessions. And so it's set up for, I think, a challenging negotiation along with return to office issues. So, that is another piece that's not in the budget, but certainly is baked into all of the operations numbers here. Let's go to the next slide. And this is super familiar territory for Tom and I, because right around this time of the year as well, the commissioner of MMB would go to New York or Zoom into New York and have a call with the rating agencies. And it was really instructive for me. Each time I did this, whether as commissioner or a state budget director, to sort of look at it and take really broad view of what's going on in the state, because after you go through the hand fighting and the wringing, hand wringing as well of all the issues that you have to deal with in legislative session, it's like, well, what's going on in Minnesota and how does it stack up to other places? And this is just a little reminder that Minnesota continues to be a really remarkable place. And that's one of the reasons why it's a AAA state again. It's one of the reasons why we are able to manage, I think, these budgets over time without surprising citizens, without having a lot of sawtooth kind of decision making where we do stuff and then take it away. Because it's really important, because at the end of the day, it's how do we work to grow the economy? How do we help to serve Minnesotans? And that's really based on long-term forecasts, our ability to really get data in front of legislators and decision makers to understand what are the trade-offs. Having risk management built into the discussion in part by having longer term looks at the economy and our budget trends. Our workforce continues to be really a more than average, much more than average leading, in participants in the labor market. We have more of our population in the labor pool than most places. And our economy is unusually balanced. So unlike South Dakota or other places, to pick on other states where they may have great years because natural gas or oil is selling, but the next year they're not, our economy is actually balanced and looks an awful lot like the national economy. And so, if you're thinking about your own, stocks or retirement portfolio, you always try to balance it so you're not like going too high or too low, but you're sort of going with the general trend. Minnesota also has that feature as a general state economy. Um, I, I would say we're still in that position, Tom. Would you agree?
I think so. I do. And the one thing the best way to get a sense of where it's going is to look at charts like this. But I always, again, simplify. And I look to, if you're looking for one number to try to gauge in all of this, I look at the GDP numbers. If you're, if the state's economic forecast or is stating that GDP is going down from the previous forecast, then chances are that's going to affect revenue and everything else. I mean, I feel like a lot of this, and I'm not an economist, I'm a lawyer, but I think a lot of that wraps up into that. And as I looked at the state puts out the quarterly updates, and they're about on what they anticipated. Um, 2 points.
Last month.
Yeah. Yeah. So last month. So we'll see where it goes from here. But that's kind of one of the things I look at to try to, whether you're reading the Wall Street Journal, the Pioneer Press, the Star Tribune, or you listen on the radio, I look to GDP based on the previous forecast to give me a idea, because sometimes all these charts hurt my head.
And to build on that point, Tom, I think the newest state economist, and note that we do have a new state economist, Laura Kolobakides, step down, and I haven't actually met the new state economist. I'm not sure if you have, Tom.
No,
But
I met him once.
have you? Okay. But and another professor coming in to try to sort of lead what's a growingly professional team there at MMB. But I think their most recent update on the GDP numbers were actually a little below what they had baked into the February forecast. So those would certainly be some storm clouds as we're looking forward. Next slide. Just gets you sort of into that. What are we watching? Those indicators. The GDP is one piece of it. Another piece is just what's happening in different sectors, because that's what you're going to see going on in the news. And there's been growth in some sectors and shrinkage in others, and whether that's going to continue. Because Minnesota is really balanced, it means that we're probably experiencing all of these things. But as we're going to talk about in a few minutes about healthcare cuts at the federal level, or changes in federal state funding or other things. It's like, some of those places where you saw growth in employment over the previous year probably are going to be under a lot of pressure going forward. I'm actually coming right out of a board meeting here at a long-term care provider, and certainly that is a significant concern here.
Go ahead, Jim. Nothing for you there.
All right, let's go on then. What we're watching, another thing, this is really getting to that point Tom was making, giving you a little bit of data and seeing where the February forecast was in those light sort of teal color bars, and the green ones is where the July forecast was. So it's we're largely tracking. I don't know. I wouldn't look at those changes if I was sitting in the commissioner's chair and say, "Oh no, this is terrible." But that the change in 25 is the most impactful because it takes all the other growth numbers down. So it's why I would then quickly look at the receipts and the revenues, and are we collecting revenues on course, or are we off? Are we already starting to see that? And fortunately, the June numbers were really significantly up. They're $847 million up, $62 million short in July. Risk of a recession is the other sort of like big question, whether you see a recession coming. I don't remember a time, Tom. Do you? I cannot remember a time when I went to the Council of Economic Advisors and they said, yeah, we're going to put a recession in the forecast, even though some of them did personally want to. Our national forecast was loath to ever put it into the forecast. I don't think they would do that at this point, given what we're seeing now. But
No, they just what they do is if they think it's going to happen, they put the probability up a little bit. And if you watch it over a period of years, you can kind of tell and that if they think it's going to happen. But yeah, they don't want to say it because then they think they caused it.
Yep, that's exactly right. It's one of those things where if you say it's going to come, it just might. The next one, next slide, gets you to concluding thoughts before we get into sort of some more topical stuff. Just, the obvious. We said it before, but K-12 and HHS is driving the state budget. Each of K-12 has finally been caught by HHS in the share of the general fund budget. In terms of overall budget, actually HHS is bigger because they get a lot more federal funds, but each is now 38% of the state general fund budget. And the long-term outlook really is this combination of having one-time balances, now spending those down over time, making corrections so that you can get your spending in line with your revenues, even as we're figuring out what's happening with Medicaid changes and upcoming elections and everything like that.
And just a few comments on the chart. One, and Mary Beth, you talked about it a little bit before we began about the fraud, Medicaid fraud. And I know that I always worried about fraud when I was at M&B. I mean, I worried about it every day. But I noticed, and if anybody remembers, the Great Recession. The Great Recession hits in 2008. Obama comes into office, and at that time they passed the largest stimulus ever. It was like almost $1 trillion. But I remember the things we did in 2009 and 10. People were out of work. Revenues were dropping. People were getting on the, and it's going on to Medicaid. The deficit was going sideways. That money came in from the federal government, and there was a tremendous amount of pressure to get that money out. And I'm not excusing what the Walz administration did, but I can feel and understand the pressure, from 21, 22, and 23 when all of this was happening. And I get it. from just that 2-year period we had, Jim, back then.
I agree.
I do think there'll be a lot of discussion next session. I don't necessarily believe that the legislature will do anything. If these numbers continue to hold and we kind of have a little bit of money here and there after the November and the February forecasts, I can see both sides, the Republicans and the Democrats, thinking, well, I'm going to win the election. Let's go ahead and just carry this forward and let the money sit on the bottom line, and we'll take it up in 27.
Yeah, I would add on the fraud concerns, issues. I mean, it's always a concern. I mean, it's just always a concern. And I would agree that the stimulus package back in the Obama years, or the more recent stimulus package in the Biden years, really what the emphasis was on responding to crisis, moving things through, really having as much flexibility as possible. And when you take off some of the guardrails, bad things can happen. And I also think it's really hard but necessary to recognize when those periods are over and put the guardrails back on. And that's easier said than done, much easier said than done. So that you're trying to get back to that place where people in the systems and the organizations are able to catch and understand and get those processes back. I'm sure they will, but I would be surprised if we don't continue to see issues, whether in Minnesota or other places, just because you kind of have this feast or famine kind of notion. Um, I just want to add one problem, or sort of observation some of you lived through, is just as we look at potential budget challenges coming into the future years. I think it is fair for people, particularly in the Health and Human Services area, to say, "Uh-oh," because if you look at this graph, even though it's extraordinarily large scale, you will see that one of the few places where you got big growth is in Health and Human Services, also in E12, but a lot of that's also going to be population based. So it's like that is a consideration as you're looking at changes and trying to understand what's happening with the impacts of the Medicaid changes at the federal level. It is really going to be challenging because a lot these programs are, remember, state federal share. So when the federal government pulls out on paying some things, whether in broad brush by federal legislation or smaller things from CMMS or other people doing things, the state share, the state costs tend to go up unless we turn off the spigot and say people are ineligible or we change the programs. And so that's going to be just a really difficult challenge going forward. And that is really kind of baked into that federal state partnership. The Medicaid changes are all backloaded, so while we're going to see some changes in the next few years, they just keep on piling up. And so by 4 and 5 years and 6 years, you're really going to start to see them grow. But it isn't even until 8 or 10 years, based upon some preliminary information I've seen, that you won't really get the full impact of some of the changes that are being proposed or are now in federal law.
But in the short term, even if something happens in the next 3 to 6 months, the state does have a $3 billion reserve and cash flow set aside. So they've done a pretty good job, both parties, at making sure that money is available. And even though there's very few legislators that are now serving that were around in 2002, the first decade of this millennium, whatever, where we had $6 billion deficits and we were always crawling our way out of the hole for the first 10 years. Now they have some money. So
not even too many legislators were around in 2009 and 10 when we were forecasting how much cash we had on hand for the next month, and whether we were going to be able to pay our bills. And so, this is a much better place to be.
yes.
And it gives us everyone a chance to sort of look at what's happening, make adjustments, and point towards it rather than try to make instantaneous changes. It's a much better place to be. Next slide. gets us to some more concluding thoughts and changes. I touched on the automatic state budget impacts and federal changes, how that's going to go through the funding pressures just to maintain services. And so I know that state and county governments are already sort of bracing and trying to look at that. And I just want to point out that administrative resources are also one of those things that are going to be challenging. The state agencies, a lot of them get significant federal funds, whether it's the Department of Health, some of the activities are the Department of Human Services, other places where they may be, in DHS's instance, running computer systems that are largely like 90% funded by the federal government. As some of those changes, there are some changes to that, or it's less on the federal dollar, it again is going to create real issues and pressures on the state budget that I think we're all waiting to get clued into in the next few months. And so I think we kind of alluded to it, but additional impacts are going to be expected. This November forecast will probably be significant not only for the update of the economic information and the new 4-year horizon, but also for the kind of information that we would expect from state agencies about what they see as being the impacts of federal changes and the timeline and types of questions that it's going to cause for state budget decisions next year. Next slide is right, but I want to go back. This is the slide I didn't put in, or it's in a deck that I apparently didn't save properly because there was just a court decision just the other day that is probably you probably all caught because you're attuned to the news. But I'm going to turn to our lawyer of your presenters, Tom Hanson, with the change in the challenge to the omnibus bill and the one topic in a omnibus bill.
On Monday, Ramsey County District Court Judge Leonardo Castro struck down the binary trigger ban that was in House File 5247, the 2024, at the end of the 2024 legislative session. And it was a 1,400-page bill that basically every supplemental bill got rolled in, and it had 73 articles. And it ended up passing on the last night. And it was a very rancorous passage in the half hour before midnight, with Republicans in both bodies standing up and yelling. For those of you that remember what decorum was in the House and the Senate, they yelled the whole time, and you could barely hear. And it was anyway, this is arising from that. And if you go to the last 3 pages of Judge Castro's opinion, he chastises the legislature. He cites a couple of the different cases from the past, but he makes it very clear that you've gone too far. You shouldn't have done this, but out of deference to the legislature, I'm not going to overturn the whole thing. I'm just going to strike down the binary trigger ban, which probably was the one thing that about 132 of the legislators agreed to and really wanted. But he invited basically and said we could see lawsuits for years. So that's fascinating. And I know I've seen emails. I've just pulled one up now. There's some of the significant things that were in that bill that I think you might see challenged. There was some implementation timeline and very, tweaking of paid family and medical leave that makes implementation easier. Now it's still the main paid family leave went into effect in 2023, so that's not an issue. The Uber Lyft minimum wage was in that bill. And there's probably, I would assume, you expect the rideshare, Uber, and Lyft themselves to probably sue on this. There were some enhanced penalties for earned sick and safe time. Um, the new state patrol headquarters was in there. We could go on and on and on. But the attorney general ended up saying he was going to appeal. It'll go to the Supreme Court and they will sort this all out. But if you look at the single subject and the creep that has happened over the years, and when I worked at the State House and when I was in the administration, omnibus bills were, they serve a purpose. But Judge Castro said, yeah, you might have gone too far. 1,400 pages. And anyway, the final 3 pages of that were some of the more interesting and colorful language I have seen from a judge. And incidentally, Judge Castro was appointed by Governor Dayton and is considered a fairly liberal judge, in his leanings and things like that. So this wasn't a Pawlenty right-wing appointee or anything like that. So anyway, it's stay tuned. Hey, Jim, I don't know if you wanted to add anything.
Nope, I don't. But I think that is just such a huge factor. There's, as always, we're all trying to figure out what's happening next year. Is there going to be a special session? What's going to happen in the future? And that's just a huge issue. I see a hand up, Roz.
Thanks. Kind of getting along. Thank you for your presentation. I'm sorry I missed a little bit of it, but I was curious on these court cases. The United Health Group also sued, and I believe was not successful in their attempt to tackle the single subject rule, or did I miss that? If you could comment on that, if you know.
I am not familiar. It wasn't related to this bill.
No, it was. I think it was a previous year that they tried refuting it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there was a case. The last big case was, I think, 1990, and the court made the comment that they're going to trust the legislature. They gave admonitions that, I think you've gone too far on this, and be careful going forward. And then there have been I haven't studied all the single subject cases over the years, but they usually get struck down but this particular fact pattern is beyond what we've seen before. And courts always tend to want to comment on that. It's also, I also find it interesting that the Gun Owners Caucus, which is a fairly out there group, the binary trigger was, for those that don't know, it was a result of the shootings in Burnsville or Bloomington, where the guy was able to squeeze off 2 rounds with 1 trigger, and it was literally everybody agreed to this. I don't think there was one legislator in either party that spoke out against this. And it's the one thing in the bill that gets struck down. But Roz, be interesting to take a look at that. I'm guessing it didn't rise to the level to be overturned.
Yeah, and I'm thinking it might have been like 2018, something like that, and it wasn't as I think there still were some. I don't remember how many omnibus bills there were that year, but you're right. It was an attempt.
Oh yeah, it was.
That's why this is. I think that's why this is kind of notable, because this isn't the first time people have speculated about omnibus bills getting too big. It's the first time in my knowledge that a court actually agreed.
But he did significantly talk about, you can't just say he said that it's financing of state government. Well, and he cited various things that had nothing to do with finance that were in there. And 73 articles, he went to some detail demonstrating.
I don't know. Do you have any other hands up, or just take yourself off mute and if there's any questions?
Gentlemen, Gene Pulowski, I've got a question for you. Given the recent, well, not recent, but the addiction that the legislature has to introducing bills in record amounts every session, and that we're now approaching probably another 5,000 bill session, even though this session was 23 days late. What suggestions would you have, particularly to the finance committees, when they're having hearings? Should they be hearing budgets or should they be hearing bills?
Well, Gene, that's always an interesting point coming from you. But what happened this last session, the Republicans had were in control theoretically for the first month and a half of the legislative session. By the time while they were, even though all of that was thrown out, a number of Republican bills got heard. So by the time that the Dems got the gavels, the Republicans didn't hear any of their bills. So the Democratic chairs wanted to have hearings in the evenings and on the weekends, but for across the board, the Republicans refused. So there was a lot of really worthy, some of them stuff I supported, that didn't get a hearing because of that. So as far as proposals, I know in other states, I don't know if it's North Dakota where everybody gets assured of one bill, one hearing.
But that's not really answering my question. This session was an anomaly. I'm going back now to all of the sessions as the introductions of bills have escalated. And the fact that we are not hearing budgets, we're hearing bills. And that you're hearing bills without any idea of what the budget is. So you're hearing a bill, let's say it's one of Tom's bills. Well, it's a nice bill, you like it. How does it really impact the budget? Because you haven't had a hearing on the budget yet. And if you go to health and human suffering, you really got a problem if you start hearing bills without understanding that budget.
Well, part of the problem is you have joint policy and finance committees. I felt when I started at the legislature, you talked more in finance committee about the fiscal impact, and the policy committees were more broader policy, and you had more. This would have been the early 90s to mid to late 90s. Wasn't until the Republicans, when we took over, that we combined the committees. But I think that's more than anything part of it.
Well, I go back to when we had accounts, and each account had a change order, and that change order was either positive, negative, or flat, and there was an explanation. And it took you weeks literally to work through those accounts. That's disappeared in the legislature. Now you have PowerPoint fluff when you have, fonts about the size of a Volkswagen, and then they say, please give me 4.5 billion probably.
Yeah, well, yes. You probably need more. One argument, not my argument, but one argument would be they're getting to the point where there's so many proposals and so many things going on. You need the legislature to meet more to talk about this stuff. You'll have 15 bills in a session, and the bill will be talked about for 3 minutes, and then each person gets 2 minutes, and you move on, and you're supposed to come up with a decision.
But that's assuming you should be even hearing those bills. I think it's the responsibility of a chair to say no more than it is yes, and then to make sure they understand if they're hearing a bill, what implication does that bill have if you're a fiscal chair on the budget that's before you or the accounts that are before you?
I don't think this answers your question, but it's a great question. But I would just say that the longer I've been in this business, the more I look back and say, I wish we had done something differently. And one of those would be the slow movement away from real conference committees to more centralized negotiations. And every time we did it, it was for good reason. Oh yeah, I get why we're doing it. But it really did negate the power of the chair to steer the ship, that committee's ship. and put them in the best position. Instead, it was at a kind of a larger negotiating, and it meant that everyone was taking more oppositional positions going into the end game rather than figuring out what is necessary to make it happen. And so I don't have a great answer for you either, except that I recognize that the whole process is not geared for that line item analysis to the way that it used to be, at least in my opinion, where we really did have to go through those things in committee early on rather than put a lot of things together late in session.
I strongly agree with that, and I've just been very sad to see this move to have one big bill and maybe 5 people representing some of the finance committees, but not even all of them. And then everybody else has to choke down the whole bill or else. I have a different question though. And that is, and I maybe just obviously don't know enough about it, but when you said the federal changes to Medicaid and Health and Human Services and so forth, some of them won't show up for years. How does that work? Is the legislation passed with implementation dates and they're triggered? And, I wondered about that when I've been reading just as much as I have on this, if that wasn't how they got some of the reluctant Republicans to support this, that, well, it's not going to take effect for a while. Your constituents won't see it. And then if I were somebody hoping it, not liking it very much, but following the party line, I would also hope maybe the Democrats would get in there and save me from them ever taking effect. So could you talk about that?
Yeah. I at a very high level, it's like absolutely there's timing that these cuts are going to happen. And so it is what people are trying to unpack. But just as an example, this is one chart that I recently saw, and I've got it here. By 2027, there was an estimated a little over $40 billion in federal Medicaid reductions. That's nationwide. But by 2030, that number jumps to around 110. And then you go just to a couple of years later to 2032, it's over almost 140. So you can see the backloading of them as they start to both, I think, occur. And then also, I assume they're cumulative because when you make changes to a growing program, it also just then sort of telescopes out as you go along.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
That's what I feared, but I was hoping something better.
Yeah. I saw in the chat your question. I'll read it off as given the projected future demographics, what mix of revenues would be optimal for the state budget? I'd say more. What do you have an optimal a mix there, Tom?
I would think that the more you move towards a user-based type of tax, that tends to mirror the economy a little more, but then it becomes very regressive. So your tax purists would like that.
So I look at particularly what would happen with the income tax with an aging population.
Oh, yeah.
Is the Revenue Department taking a look at that, as far as we know?
I just remember when the proposals, remember Dr. Stinson, who was the state economist, always complaining, why are we going to eliminate income tax on Social Security or do all these things? When everybody gets older, we need them to pay because the cohort they're all going to be that age and then they're going to use more services. We're not paying attention to that. And I think anytime you rely on the income you start getting away from economic activity.
Yeah.
Jim, don't you think? I don't know.
I think that's right. I think that's right. That's a hard one. I think that Minnesota is right in having a very balanced approach rather than going all in on one way or another, like some states, Florida, Texas, other places. We have it all on one leg of your revenue source. But I think the more that it can be sort of tracking activity, it's smart. I would just sort of also just be aware. It's like hearing from a board member talking about vacancies, and it's like, so just remember also that there's going to be parts of it where it's just like when the economy shifts, it's really painful, and so you're going to see property tax revenues and all kinds of stuff like that also really be under pressure in different times of the year. And I'm not quite sure what the tax mix result or sort of advice on that is, but just know that your different policies are going to tax policies are going to just perform very differently in volatile times like this. Okay. I happy to take other questions or have you talk amongst yourselves because it feels quite odd. I'll say for myself, knowing the reservoir of experience and understanding you got looking back at me. Are there other things you want to talk about? All right. Senator.
I'm just waving goodbye because I have to leave. But
Very
thank you
good.
so much,
Very good.
Tom and Jim.
Thank you.
I lived it. I appreciated though the historical perspective that I also lived, but don't remember. So we've had rougher times for sure.
Yeah, and just to thank you for your service. Thank everyone on this call for your service. Tom and I have worked alongside and grown up behind you, and I can still remember being scared walking into a Senate Finance Committee chaired by Jean Merriam. So just like this is like an august group, and so thank you.
Could I just ask one more question? So what would be the two of you's prediction? You've been behind the doors in the caucuses. And, I just really respect Judge Castro and his decision. And I'm so old that I can remember when we had a similar admonition from the Supreme Court. I forgot the judge's name, Yetka or something like that, not to have so many omnibus bills. What do you think the chances are that the legislature will change in any way based on Judge Castro's ruling?
I think they'll go back to what they used to do. The 2024 was an interesting situation. Another year where they got started late. And as it got towards the end of the legislative session, the Republicans in both bodies realized that if they start dragging things out, they were pushing the DFL majorities into a corner. So I mean, it was a mutual thing that led to it, and I think they need to try to think that through a little bit better. But the other thing, it's always easy to sit in the peanut gallery. I didn't understand, in this case, it was you think back to 24 that Saturday, Omar Fateh, when they were negotiating with him about the Uber Lyft stuff. At some point, and I'm looking at everybody on here, you've all been in positions at the legislature where the staff tell you, well, we're kind of beyond the point where we can get done. I think they would have been better just to roll the whole thing into a special session. Or I didn't understand why they didn't. They had a whole day on Sunday just doing nothing. I mean, they had some bills that weren't going to happen. They could have broke that thing up into like multiple different bills, like 2 or 3, and it might have been better. But I think it was a mutual, and I think they're going to step back. They know where the line is now.
Yeah, I agree.
But it was always easier to manage. You throw all that stuff, it's easy. You get caucuses that are so close. You're tied, or 68, 66 that everybody here knows. It's easy to point the finger at them, but at the same time, you force everybody to vote for an omnibus bill, and they can say they like something and dislike other things in it, but they do it for the good of the team.
From the outside, it looked to me anyway, like, 2 women leaders wanting to be done on time. Everybody wanted to be done on time. And then we all know that if you wait like a day on Sunday with nothing happening, and then it's the last minute and everyone wants to be done on time. It's easier to get the caucus to vote for bad provisions.
I just think it's always tough to, you get caught in the moment. They would have been better to go a couple of days, but I remember making those kind of mistakes too.
By the way, there never were Sunday sessions until
Oh, yeah, I know.
latter, about 2000, I think,
Oh,
maybe
yeah, it was.
1999. Not what, wasn't when I was around.
I
And
was
thank you
in
for
the
that,
room.
Dee.
Yeah, I was in the room for the screaming match between Steve Swigum, Dick Cohen, and Dean Johnson, circa 2005, over the issue on a Sunday, and one
Yeah.
legislator saying he doesn't care about religion, he just wants to golf on Sunday. So, and it wasn't who you were hit on. Anyway,
You know, Tom, this is Gene Merriam, and I'm pleased you brought up that subject, you and Jim brought up that subject of the single subject rule and how it's been ignored. You know, and it was just a couple of weeks ago, there was another case that was equally prime that went the other direction in the Ramsey County District Court. I think it was Judge Ireland in that court. And he ruled, he did not strike down as he was petitioned to do in a court case. I think it's going to be really interesting to what the court does with it at the next level, because I'm sure it's going to go to the appeals court and to the Supreme Court, because now they've got a force there that's going to bring it about, I'm pretty sure. And it was Judge Yetka that said back in the 80s, maybe even the 70s, that when he was on the Supreme Court, that it was something to the effect that it was a pernicious worm that has now taken over. And
I've seen that.
And that we're warning you, it's not going to happen again. And the Supreme Court went on and issued those warnings and admonitions several times in the intervening decades. So I think it's right for that issue to come to the fore, particularly with 1,400 pages and 73 articles and things so unrelated to financing state government as the binary trigger provision, which I'm sure has a great political support as well as public support. So it'll be interesting.
Oh, yeah. And I think the Supreme Court has their hands full. I don't know how, can't imagine they overturn it, but at the same time, are we going to see a flurry of litigation for the next 3 to 5 years over everything somebody doesn't like in the bill? They gotta, I don't know. I don't know the solution.
Well, the solution's obvious.
Well, yeah,
better
but you already have the problem. Yeah, you already have the problem.
Yeah.
Right. Well, we certainly appreciate your information that you provided. It looks like we are running out of time, but it's always great to hear from two experts as yourselves, and we appreciate everybody who was able to participate today. And maybe we should do a program on single subject. Who knows?
There you go.
Good idea.
All right. Well, take care, everybody.
Thank you
Bye.
all.
Seeing everyone.
you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.